All right, welcome back, friends, to the afternoon session of day one. It is my tremendous privilege to introduce to you Charles Stewart. Charles Stewart is the Kenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also one of the original founders of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. Immediately in the wake of the 2000 election, I found myself lost. I had just finished my first math research project. I had published a paper. It gave me an Eredish number of 3. And I thought, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. What am I going to do with my life? And I read about the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project in the LA Times. And I thought, oh, I know what I want to do with my life. Charles Stewart is an incredible teacher. He is beloved by undergraduates. He served as the head of house for an undergraduate house at MIT and lived with the undergraduates. He's a deep comprehension of history and brings to you today a really exciting presentation. So with no further ado, Charles Stewart.
Thanks, Betsy. That was a really remarkable and generous introduction. I have to admit, I am delighted, though, that it didn't involve any stories of me having to hold your hair while you had the stomach flu. Although I have to say, in 23 years as the head of house, I had some experiences similar to that. I never quite had that one. It's a great delight to be here. Let me get my slides up and see if that works. And actually, after 5 years, you would just think that I could figure this thing out, but I still can't. So Betsy, tell me whether it's the slide or my desktop.
It's the slide. It looks great.
Okay, great.
And I'll organize your questions during the presentation. So you talk and let me work on the questions.
Sounds great. Yes, so that was as I said, a very generous introduction. I'm really delighted to be here today. Like other folks before me, I want to thank Mike and Betsy for being the co-organizers and everyone who has supported the efforts to get us together for these couple of days, despite the difficulties in Los Angeles. And again, I just want to recognize the heartbreaking events going on in LA, and especially thank the folks from Caltech for pulling through and making this work. So thank you all very much. Our hearts, minds, and prayers are with all of y'all out in Southern California. So I'm going to talk today about on the topic of trust and integrity in the 2024 election, and focusing on public opinion. I have a bit of a roadmap here. Before hopping into the public opinion of trust and integrity, there's a bit of background that I want to talk about. This is a mixed conference, mixed group of academics and election officials. From looking at the participants, a lot of folks have been in this community before, but not everyone has. And so in the interest of level setting among the various communities, I want to say a bit of background on the intellectual side, the professional side, and then also the kind of the political policy side. So I'll talk about some prior research into this area of trust and integrity. One of the things in the process of doing that I'm not going to apologize. I'm going to do some shameless shilling and describe some projects that are ongoing right now that I want to draw people's attention to. Again, some folks will be aware of these projects in the area of trust and integrity, but others won't. And I think they're relevant both to my remarks and to the topic of this conference. I'm going to say just a word about a distinction that I'm trying to make, and I'm encouraging people to make, between what I'm calling trust and what I'm calling trustworthiness. and just to help kind of focus our attention on what we mean when we talk about these concepts. Then after a little bit of throat clearing, I will jump into the actual empirical part of the talk. The empirical part of the talk will rely heavily on the survey of the performance of the American elections. And I will talk about that survey, give some background for those who aren't aware of it. And then after that, we'll jump into the data. We'll talk about trust from the voters' perspective as reflected in the SPAE in 2024. I'll provide some context to the prior years in which we've been conducting the same survey over time. The SPAE, the survey, allows us to drill into some issues that have not shown up in some of the more commercial surveys that have addressed this topic in the last several weeks, particularly geographic variability of trust in American elections. Say a bit of a word about closeness, the role of voting by mail, and how that's played out in 24 compared to 2020. Questions about fraud and reform, how voters are thinking about fraud and reform. So mostly I'm going to be talking, or I think when you think about how voters, think about the integrity of the election, and how much they trust elections. But this also adjacent to that are important questions of what sort of bad things do voters think is going on. Politicians certainly talk about that. Social movements, political movements arise over that. And people come up with ideas about reforms to presumably either make elections better or to instill greater trust in the process. We'll talk about a bit about that. There's also been in the last several years efforts not only to tighten up the security features of election administration, but to communicate with voters about what state and local officials are doing to secure elections. We have some nationwide soundings on what voters know about these efforts and what they would like to see happen with respect to security efforts. And then I will conclude with some thoughts about not only kind of sum up the findings, but make some references to policy and to future research. So first of all, just a little bit of previous research that will kind of help ground my remarks. There is a lot of research into this field of, broadly speaking, into confidence, trust in elections. I'm part of a strand of that, and one piece that is going to be particularly relevant today is a paper I co-wrote with my former student Mike Sansis about a decade ago, where we consolidated all of the studies that have been published over the last couple of decades into voter trust nationwide and how voters trust their own experience. And in that research, we plotted out the patterns of the winner and loser effect in a cross-time analysis. And so some of the work today will pick up that prior analysis and bring it into the present. It also touched on the different levels at which voters experience elections, ranging from their own personal experience to experiences that move further and further from their own direct knowledge, to what's happening to their neighbors, to what's happening in the state, and what's happening nationally. And we found in that research, and we'll see evidence of it again in 2024, that not only are voters more confident about what they actually experience than what they hear about through the news and other media, but that phenomena like the winner-loser effect are much more susceptible to change in our attitudes about trusting the national process or trusting what's happening in the state than our own experience. Although there again, there is evidence that some of the national issues, who wins the presidency, particularly, actually does leak a little bit into how individuals judge their own experience. But the biggest effects of big national movements are actually occur at the national level. I also have to acknowledge, and I'm not entirely sucking up here because Betsy gave me such a nice introduction, but I would also note that a paper written or published in 2018 with Betsy as one of the co-authors is I would say another important landmark study in this area, because there, among other things in that study, they not only they put the winner-loser effect in the context of what was being said by political leaders, particularly in that case, Donald Trump in 2016. Okay, so, and one of the things that we've learned over the last decade is not only is there a winner or loser effect that voters maybe could evaluate on their own, that increasingly we're beginning to appreciate the degree to which political leaders navigate and interpret for voters how they should feel about the outcome of elections. And I think that study, if you haven't read it, is a really important one for identifying that as a mode of study. And then finally, I just mentioned that Mike Sansas recently has published a piece very similar to our originally 2015 piece, where he talked about this question of legitimacy and whether voters believe outcomes are legitimate, which is slightly different from this question about whether they are confident that the electoral process played out properly. And in general, what Mike finds there is that people are more likely to believe elections are legitimate, even when they might have questions about voter confidence. And I just put it out there just to as an opportunity to remind us that I'm going to be talking about a particular measure of confidence, trust, some people might call legitimacy. These ideas are related to each other, and we can move back and forth in talking about them. I'm going to be focusing here, though, on really what kind of the election administration aspect of things and how voters feel about what's happening. Now, to kind of ease into things, but to as a matter of introduction and also to point to other things going on, I just want to alert folks, if y'all aren't aware, that my lab, the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, MedSol, has been doing a number of convenings and other research projects over the last couple of years to try to kind of develop a series of research strategies and agendas for the election science and election administration communities. One of the things we did in this regard was a bit over a year ago, we had 7 teams of prominent election scientists, mostly academics, but not entirely, write 7 white papers to assess the state of research in election science broadly. They wrote 7 white papers. There was a big convening at MIT about 15 months ago. And then there was a later convening on the issue of trust. And I would encourage folks to take a look at that effort. If you don't know about it, here's the QR code. You can go directly to go directly to the website for that project. Here on the slide are the seven white papers. The one that's relevant for my discussion here was a white paper that was organized by Brendan Nyan, but several other people contributed to it. Again, some folks who are part of this conference, writing specifically on the issue of communicating with voters to build trust in the U.S. election system. It's not a long white paper. I encourage you to download it and read it. And again, here's the QR code, and you'll be able to get it from the slides if you didn't capture it on the screen.
Charles,
Just
I
very
now
brief.
see you, but not the slides. I don't know if everyone else sees you and not the slides.
Oh, I can see. Yep. audience can see slides and both of
Okay.
you. Yep, we're
Thank
good.
you. Sorry.
Okay. Phew. Thank God, I tried to start over. All right. Um, my slides still up?
Slides still up.
Right.
Yep, they
Okay.
just changed. You're good.
Okay, great. Okay, so that white paper, which it's interesting to read the white paper in light of what's on the agenda in this meeting, because the white paper reflects the state of play a year ago, and a lot of things have happened over the last year. But just to note that within this field of trust in elections, there have been these four areas of research over the last several decades that have gotten a lot of attention. The winner-loser gap, which I've already touched on, the important role of personal experience, different types of messaging strategies utilized by election officials, and the use of different media. And there's a number of strong findings, and that was one of the goals of this white paper project, was to find where there's really solid evidence about things that election officials should be doing, and places where maybe we don't need to do so much research because there's other areas where there's real gaps. But there's very strong findings about, for instance, elites being really critical to driving messages related to trust. That independent election monitoring can be quite effective in building trust. Encouraging, and this is kind of, some people may have mixed feelings about these findings, but they appear to be pretty strong, that efforts in recent years to encourage voters to go to trusted sources has indeed led to voters going to trusted sources, election officials, et cetera, to get information about elections. But it's not clear that doing so has increased trust among the people going to those sources. And then there's findings related to transparently communicating about counting delays that can be helpful. But much more research is needed. Here are seven areas. I'm not going to read them all because I want to get into the substance of the talk. But a couple of things I would note. The first one is the methodological point, is that a lot of the research in this area heretofore has been based on observational data. And indeed, most of the rest of my talk is going to be observational. But I think what we're interested in, and many of us who are on this conference are really interested in, is what I usually call news you can use. That is finding things that actually work when implemented to encourage voters to have a clearer idea, more accurate idea of elections. And in order to do that the best, we need research that basically draws from experimental design and other types of methods that allow us to hone the causal mechanisms by which various tactics work. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of causally identified experimental discussion of my own research in this talk, but this sort of research really is called for, and I'm glad to see a lot of that reflected in the agenda. And so you can see the seven ideas here. I will leave those there. And then finally, we currently have a collaboration with the Yankelovich Center down at UCSD, with Hopkins and the SNF Agora Institute, to try to encourage some of these, kind of well-identified, rigorous studies of trust that not only are well organized and well designed, but also, very importantly, are conducted in collaboration with election officials. And that research is being reported. Some of that research is being reported at this conference. And I'm really delighted about that. And here's three of the studies. And this slide is just to acknowledge again something that I've been saying all along, that this conference is evidence that even in the last year, the ball has been moved significantly forward, both in terms of learning more about trust in elections and what can move the ball there, but also in developing deep relationships between election officials and academics in trying to see what's working, and that's really, really exciting. The final thing I would just say here, and this is, maybe we can talk about this on the side. I'm also showing this slide because I'm really fascinated with this guy behind the hand lens there. I can only imagine how small his head must really be, if it's still small when it's behind a magnifying glass. But anyway, that's a side point. The final point I'll make before jumping into the empirics is just I would also encourage folks to take a look at an essay I wrote a couple of years ago that appeared in Daedalus. And this was a special edition issue on institutions, experts, and loss of trust. And this whole issue took on the matter that within the United States, and certainly in the Western world, there is a challenge to the trust in institutions, and election administration is not alone. And there's a bunch of other areas as well that we can learn from. In that essay that I wrote for this volume about trust in elections, one of the things I tried to distinguish between was trust and trustworthiness. Trustworthiness, I defined as just taking it straight out of Merriam-Webster. And a trustworthy election is one that follows the rules of the game, that are conducted in such a way that an impartial observer would agree that the declared winner of an election actually won. It's built on the rules of the game, and these rules are what formal authorities use to adjudicate the results. There's a separate thing, and it's related, but sometimes these two things get inflated with each other. There is the matter of trust. And trust, I distinguish here as being a psychological construct that describes the conclusion reached by the mass public about the functioning of the process. And we know from the literature that trust is built by a combination of factors, including direct observation, but also, and importantly, and as we think about judging things happening away from our direct observation, it includes hearsay from friends and neighbors, and it includes interpretations from prominent people we trust in other areas of our lives. And with respect to trustworthiness, this is an analogy we've used in the voting technology project for a quarter century, that there's a chain of things that have to happen to create a trustworthy election, and one break in the link can undermine trustworthiness altogether. Another point that I would make, and I've already alluded to it, is that there's a lot of talk and assumptions, and certainly rhetoric in the political sphere that just assumes that a trustworthy election in people's minds, that is an election run according to the rules that some set of people would prefer, would automatically lead to voters trusting the results. And we see these claims being made all the time. Here are three relatively recent ones. There's many, many more out there. But there is an important question about whether the world aligns trust and trustworthiness together, or the degree to which they can push in opposite directions. And I'll just leave this as something to think about. I think we as scholars, especially scholars and others who are trying to bring fact-based improvements to elections, we need to understand very clearly under what conditions, if we change policy, if we change practices, will the mass public be more confident in elections? And that's a good thing to do to instill greater trust. But there's likely also to be changes that we would make to elections to make them more trustworthy, to make them more accessible, to make them good, that are just things that should be done to secure elections better. And I've increasingly encouraged policymakers, if they really do value being intellectually honest, not to oversell the important, the ability to move trust when what we're really trying to do is run better elections. Okay, so having said what probably way too much of throat clearing, let me jump into the survey of the performance of American elections, or the SPAE. The SPAE was started back in the teens by the Voting Technology Project. Many people on this call will remember back in the teens following the Florida election in 2000. Very frequently, we heard from the public, from reporters, from others, that the US is nothing more than a banana republic, that things are going wrong all the time, voters are having a terrible experience, and things are just really bad in America. And we on the VTP believed, well, who knows? That was our reaction. No one actually talks to voters about their experience. So why don't we talk to voters about their experience? And so in 2008, or actually in the mid 2000s, this team, and here's our first final report. Mike Alvarez was one of the founders. Adam Berinsky, I saw, was on the call, was one of the designers. There were other people who designed the survey to talk directly to voters about their experiences. And since then, we've been able to run the SPAE in most federal elections up until the present. We interview 200 people in every state, plus the District of Columbia. So the design of the survey is intended to optimize actually comparisons between states. That's one of the reasons for equal number of observations in every state. But then we also get over 10,000 respondents every election. And so when we do national estimation, we can get very precise statistical estimates. We ask core questions in the SPAE about people's experience on the in-person voting, everything from whether they had a hard time finding a polling place to if they had problems with their voting equipment. We ask analogous questions with respect to voting by mail for people who vote by mail. We ask 4 standard confidence questions that I'll get to in a bit. We ask voters about their estimates of the frequency of fraud, and of reform. They're the reform questions. Fraud questions, we'll come back to these. Non-core questions like the time of day when people vote, et cetera, where they return their ballots. We can try to be topical. In 22 and 24, we did also ask questions about disruptions at the polls, use of absentee tracking, knowledge of security features, which I will talk about in a bit, and possession of voter ID this year. These are questions we asked for a long time, and we stopped asking because voter ID became less of an important policy question. It's become more of an important policy question, and we have a bunch of questions about what voters actually possess and what they could show if they had to vote. We have a lot of covariates, lots of things on the right-hand side of regressions. Some just final administrative details. As I said, this has been going since 2008. There was a pilot. Before then, it's conducted in an internet panel by YouGov. It was originally Polymetrics. We've done some mode experiments over the years. There are some questions mirrored in the CCES. And so if you want, if you're willing to sacrifice kind of the large number of observations for a deeper dive, you can go to the CES and study some of the same questions. We've had a number of very generous funders over the years. And if you want the data, just go to the Harvard Dataverse and download it. Okay, coming into talking specifically about trust. Here are the questions that we ask people about with respect to trust. And it starts with, how confident are you that your vote in this case, the 2024 general election, was counted as you intended? We ask that only, obviously, of people who say they voted. And then we ask them everybody analogous questions about vote counting in their county or city, in their state, and throughout the nation. And we ask them to respond on a 4-point scale. I'm not going to hop over this because it's an important piece of context I want to come back to. And that is that I'm going to focus here on 2024. I will bring in the past, as you will see. But we're talking about trust in 24, I think, in large part because it became a huge issue in 2020. As I mentioned previously, as emphasized by Betsy's earlier research, it was preceded even further in 2016 when Donald Trump expressed skepticism about the process preceding the 2016 election, which resulted in a muted winner-loser effect for both parties in that election. And it also raised the salience of election administration as a political issue. And as an example, for instance, this is a time series using National Conference of State Legislature data, which shows in the upper series the number of bills introduced in state legislatures about elections. We see the big spike up in 2020 and then in the 21-22 election cycle. But a lot of this is position taking, as David Mayhew would have said. The second series shows the number of bills that have passed, and that there hasn't been the same surge in the passage of bills as there has been in the surge of introduction of bills at the state level. And there's also been a lot of legislating. Here is a description of legislative changes over the last couple of years after the 2020 election, sourced by the Voting Rights Lab. I don't 100% endorse their characterization of the states, but I think this map does illustrate well that over the last couple of years, there's become a blue state avenue of election law passage, a red state, and then there's kind of a gray state in places where there is gridlock. So let's get the voter confidence in 2024. So in some ways, I mean, this is kind of the top line. How confident are you that votes at various levels were counted as intended in 2024? And as in every other year, we've found people are much more likely to say that they are confident that their own vote was counted as intended. In this case, I'll show the next slide. About 96% gave some flavor of confident as their answer. And then it declined down to the nationwide, but still even there in 2024, a supermajority of Americans said that they were either very confident or somewhat confident that votes nationwide were counted properly. The way this is kind of the popular way of presenting the data throughout the rest of my presentation, I'm going to actually rely on the 4-point scale, because the 4-point scale gives us a bit more leverage over this issue, especially looking kind of at covariates and relationships between confidence and other factors. And so this kind of shows those same relationships using the 4-point scale. This is one of two. This is kind of for the political scientists, especially if we just do kind of as a kitchen sink regression. Just do a very simple standard multivariate regression analysis of these results in 2024. These are the results, the things that I would pull out substantively. Is that first of all, there's a lot of statistically significant results, but a lot of these effects, when it comes to especially to demographics, are really small substantively. I do note if you look at the coefficients associated with voting by mail, they are large substantively. If you vote by mail, you're about a third of a point on this 4-point scale more likely to say that you're confident in vote counting at all these levels. In past years, this coefficient was negative generally. So the fact that people who are voting by mail are more confident now, I think is worth further investigation. The other thing that I will note is that down where there's the discussion of, or the variable for polling place, that's the assessment for in-person voters, that their polling place was run well. And this ends up being this, again, one of the strongest, correlates with trusting the vote count. And not only do people who have good experiences when they vote believe their own vote was counted properly, but they generalize across all of the modes of voting, which again, we see many years, but I think it bears repeating. Here's what the geographic distribution of state confidence looks like in 24. We'll come back to some of this a bit later on. The darker the state, the more confident the respondents are in those states. So basically the kind of the Democratic Northeast and the upper Midwest, where all those Swedish socialists settled over a century ago, highest degree of confidence. The middle degree of confidence are in kind of the middle part of the state, of the country rather, where there's a large number of kind of one-party states. And then the least confident voters are, not surprisingly, largely in states that are battleground states, but there are some others that stand out. And I would note that despite the fact earlier that I remarked that people who voted by mail are more confident than people who voted in person, it looks like that voters in states like Washington, Colorado, California, where there is a lot of voting by mail, that overall state confidence is lower. Longitudinal patterns. If we look at these scores across time, going back to 2008 for the what's called egotropic measure, your own vote, and then starting in 2012, these more sociotropic measures, they've been pretty stable over time. But while the kind of the top line numbers have been pretty stable, really what has varied across time quite significantly has been party confidence. And we see blue for Democrats, red for Republicans. It's really easy to see the tanking of confidence among Republicans in 2020, how it tanks the most for national and for state compared to the counties. Come back to the geographic variability of confidence. Here, what I've done is I've plotted out for each year we have every state reflected, and as you can see, first of all, there's clusters of states in every election. The thing I would draw your attention to is that state confidence and national confidence, you see in 2020, the variability of that pile of observations increases quite notably, especially for national confidence. And this is especially notable if you were to just measure the standard deviation across all the states. And you can see in 2020, there was a big variability, historically high variability across the states in confidence about the nation. But there's also really relatively high variability in terms of state confidence, which retreated quite significantly in 2024. So 2024, you've seen this map before that showed the state level confidence in 24. Contrast this with 2020. On the same scale, we can see that overall states were depressed and their confidence, they were depressed nationwide. Very few highly confident as in 24. So again, very big differences when we look across states. Factors affecting state variability. The two I want to focus on here, I ran out of time. I wanted to do some remarks about counting speed I wasn't able to get to, but closeness in voting by mail. This is an interesting phenomenon in 2020. If we divide the samples into Democrats and Republicans, and we find the average for Democrats and Republicans in each state in 2020, and then we plot those levels of confidence against the percentage of the vote for the Democratic candidate, in this case, Biden. We see on the left, on the left-hand side of the graph, these are states that Trump won. On the right-hand side of the graph, on the left where it says state confidence Republicans, we see we see states where Democrats won. The thing I draw your attention to on the left-hand side of the slide is, first of all, just simply seeing Trump going from a winner to a loser in a state caused Republicans on average to reduce their confidence by a full point on this 4-point scale, which is really quite something. And we also see that kind of as you move toward the 50% mark, there's less and less confidence among Republicans. On the right-hand side of the slide, it shows the same thing about state confidence for Democrats. There's a kind of a similar relationship here, but the discontinuity at 50% is really, really much less. So that was 2020. Contrast with 2016, we see for Republicans, there was just no discontinuity at all. That was the year when Trump won. The only relationship among Republicans was just the more Democratic the state, the less confident Republicans were. Democrats, there was that discontinuity in 2016. Turning now to 2024, we see the discontinuity among Republicans at the state level at the kind of that 50% mark has closed now dramatically. And it's opened up quite wide among Democrats again. So here's the comparison across the two levels. There's a lot to talk about in there. I want to get to the end and deal with some questions. Just really quickly, just to kind of touch on very quickly on voter fraud and then election reform. Voter fraud, these are the dozen or so questions that we ask the respondents about. We ask things like, how often do you think people vote more than once in an election? People vote who are not US citizens. Again, it's on a 4-point scale. We've been asking these questions, an increasing number of questions of these questions since 2008. What I put up on the screen right now is the percentage of respondents saying that these various frauds are either common or occasional. Now, this is a very small, this is very tiny graphs. I'm not anticipating you actually reading them here. The takeaway here is that the overall percentage of people saying that each type of fraud is common or occasional has been relatively stable over the last decade, with a slight uptick in 2020. It won't surprise you that there was a big uptick among Republicans in 2020, which led to that national small uptick. There was also a downtick among Democrats in 2020. And we see that in 2024 that, basically the partisan patterns have returned to pre-pandemic. We can talk about, I'll just jump over this because again, I want to kind of get to the end. But people believe that certain types of fraud are more common than others. Illicitly changing the vote count is the least commonly believed fraud. And absentee ballot fraud is the most commonly believed. But there's also, we see partisan differences that wouldn't surprise this crowd at all. Differences about the prevalence of non-citizen voting and absentee ballot fraud are the biggest partisan differences. Talking about election reform, again, we've been asking about a number of election reforms over the past several years. And here similarly are the percentage of people supporting these various reforms running from automatic voter registration to voting on the weekends. Again, the reforms have been fairly flat over time. I will note that support for voting for voter IDs has been creeping up over time. Similarly, there have been these divisions between Democrats and Republicans over time, a bit of a further divide in vote by mail in 2020, but that came back to pre-pandemic levels in 2024. Here's the listing in 2024 overall of overall support for these various reforms. At the top of the list, 86% of respondents said that they supported requiring all voting machines to have a paper backup. The least popular reform is everybody voting by cell phone, and also everybody voting by mail. There are partisan differences in many of these. Some are greater, some are less. The greatest division is over automatic voter registration and election day registration. The smallest divisions are over a nonpartisan election of election officials and requiring a paper backup of all ballots. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about, and this is kind of relevant to some of the research that's being talked about here. In 2022, I noticed that Judge Choate at Colorado had done a survey in which they had asked Coloradans about their knowledge about the various security features that election officials use to secure the election, running from logic and accuracy testing, nonpartisan poll workers, observers, nonpartisan observers, partisan observers, post-election audits, and those sorts of things. And I thought, gee, wouldn't it be interesting if we put these questions to a national sample of voters? So that's what we did. The preface to the question is, regardless of whether your state does the following, how would knowing that your state took the following actions impact how much confidence you have in the security and integrity of your state's elections? So in 2024, the reform that's the most popular is logic and accuracy testing, and knowing that there's a chain of custody and security of paper ballots. Knowing about how election officials prepare against cyber attacks are unknown. And so, by the way, I recognize I may have misstated. So to state it again, LNA testing and knowing about, or claiming to know about, chain of custody for paper ballots are the things that voters say they are most knowledgeable about. They say they are the least knowledgeable about things like preparing against cyber attacks, signature verification, and those sorts of things. An interesting thing, as an aside, is gee, I misspelled knowledge there. I was interested in 22, and I did it again in 24. The percentage of people in every state who said that they were knowledgeable that their state conducted post-election audits. This is one of these security features that does vary across states. This is a graph showing the percentage of respondents in every state who said that they knew that their state conducted a post-election audit. First of all, there is no state in which there is a majority. Secondly, it is heartening that in 24, which was not true in 22, that states that actually perform post-election audits are more likely to have their voters say that they perform them than states that don't perform them. However, I would also note that Colorado, which is the state probably that has been the most out there with their post-election audits, is not particularly a standout in terms of their residents saying that Colorado does post-election audits. We also ask about the impact of confidence with knowing that the state did these things, improve your confidence. And pretty much, yes, for most of these things, I would point out that voters are less enamored of partisan poll watchers. That's the thing that they are least enamored of. There are small differences between Democrats and Republicans in 2024. They were really quite large in 2020, which is kind of heartening. So let me just say a few concluding thoughts, and then we will have, looks like we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So just about the data, the overall confidence has remained steady, but partisan polarization has declined nationally. Who knows if this will be short term? If the election results had been different, this pattern no doubt would have been different. Will Democrats in the future catch the distrustful bug? Another thing about the surveys, the mass public is not especially knowledgeable about efforts to secure elections, despite all of these efforts of election officials. Again, it's not clear whether this really matters if the really important thing is making sure elections are trustworthy. And that Republicans continue to be the more fertile ground political party for fraud beliefs and for securing the process. There are implications for policy and politics in these findings related to the pursuit of the SAVE Act, the effects of the SAVE Act on confidence, the declining partisan differences over many of these issues may take out some of the energy behind some reform activities. And the narrowing of distrust may give those of us who want to push on evidence-based improvements to kind of work with this environment more. And then finally, I'll just end with noting there are implications here in these observational studies for further research. As I suggested earlier, I'm looking forward to see causally driven research in this vein and what happens there. And then much more work can be done, certainly to work on the mechanisms that secure the mechanisms by which security measures work to improve confidence, and the mechanisms by which social movements mobilize the mass public on election confidence issues. And so with that, I will stop the share, and I apologize for filibustering a bit. I will be around even when we run out of time here, but I'm happy to see what sort of questions and comments folks have.
All right. Charles, are you ready? I've got 8 questions for you.
Okay, I'll give you 8 sentences.
Okay, good. Here we go. All right. First question, in terms of the winner effect. It's true Trump wins, but the Republicans lose a lot of seats. So why are so few voters attributing those losses to fraud? So why do we see a national level winner effect in places particularly where we've seen lower level offices go the other way? So how do those forces work in relationship to each other?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts about that, because I think this is one of the areas that's open to further research. First thing is I'll say is that, well, I mean, that's an interesting insight, and we've all had that and made that observation. I think I'll just say it appears to be true, and especially in this time where politics has been nationalized, that voters are really laser focused on national results. And I just think it's a fact that the generalization runs from national to local, and it's common to point out these sorts of inconsistencies. But voters have their own logics, and that logic is real. I will note, however, I mean, I think there are places where this kind of down ballot distrust still is working its way out. I mean, I think Arizona is a good case study. There's a couple of these states where there still is division over issues of trust, and where, as I put it in more informal settings, distrust has become metastasized, become part of the local political culture, and maybe has become permanently part of it. And so there may be some places locally where local outcomes will kind of drive some of these attitudes, but like so many other things, I'm just struck by how it's the national results that are feeding back into how people think about what's happening in the state. That's
a great answer. All right, so there's a new question that has come in from Sean. With restorative audits, would you consider new questions that include descriptions, such as a hand count to sampling to check the computer tallies?
Oh, absolutely, and and maybe, and actually, the SPAE is supposed to be a resource for the community, and what I like to do is I actually like to experiment with things in the CES, and then throw them into the SPAE, which I have done in the past with some other things. I will say, by the way, my experience, and I've done this with voter ID, because people used to say to me, well, voters, there's different kinds of voter IDs, and you're seeing all these Democrats and say they support voter ID. If they really knew what the options were, they wouldn't vote them. They wouldn't support them so much. And so I've run that experiment. Democrats love voter ID laws regardless of what you tell them about them.
That's funny.
And so my suspicion would be that voters don't care about the difference between a risk limiting audit and a regular audit, hand count, machine count. Again, trust and trustworthiness are two different things.
This relates to your answer. So how driven by partisanship is confidence, especially with respect to vote by mail? So to what extent are we seeing confidence driven by partisanship as a lens? And touching on that is having confidence that your ballot will be counted. Is that a driver of turnout as opposed to a response to an election?
Oh man, that's two different things. With
Very
respect to
different.
voting, right? But with respect to voting by mail, as I mentioned in passing, in past years, up until really this election, people who voted by mail would say that they were less confident, and they should be, right? Objectively so. You can, when you vote in person, you put your ballot in the tabulator, right? So it's not surprising. And in 2020, there were a lot of funky things going on with trust and partisanship because of the messaging about voting by mail. And that's where it turned out, and maybe this is what I'm getting a residual of in 24. Prior to the pandemic, voting by mail had a negative sign associated. Now, it's not only that Democrats are voting by mail more than Republicans, although that's not as much as it used to be. But it looks like a lot of those Democrats are voting by mail to show their allegiance to voting by mail, and that's something I think that we just need to do more study about.
All right, I have time for one more question, and then there's a couple more questions we didn't get to. So I think, we'll ask our audience to maybe hang out for a minute or two in the break and chat them to you. But so here's the question, I think, is like there's some evidence in this data of change that maybe there's you flag there's maybe not change in so much confidence, but change in the partisan discrepancy within that space. It may be the case that voters are getting increasingly confident voting by mail. To what extent are you seeing change in this data as over time, over the long time that you've been working on this project?
Yeah, the changes I'm seeing right now, there is a lot of, it is amazing how much stasis there is in the numbers. The change I'm seeing is not so much long term, but it really is, there's still, to a first approximation, voter patterns when it comes to how they vote are returning to either pre-pandemic numbers, or actually more accurately, there were trends pre-pandemic that were interrupted, but we returned to the trends, right? So for instance, voting by mail was increasing before the pandemic. It went off the charts in 2020. It's come back down, but it's about where you would have expected it to be if you had drawn the line up to 2016 and then moved it on, right? So those are the things are continuing. What I'm noticing, and I'm going to stick with voting by mail because it's the one I've noticed the most, is that in many states, and I'm thinking here about the legacy vote by mail states, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, those were states where there were partisan divides over voting by mail when they were introduced. That gap had been closing. That gap in the pandemic opened wider than it had ever been, and is closing slowly. And so one of the changes I think the data are showing is that in many of these states where we thought voting by mail had become, just kind of a nonpartisan way of doing things. Recall it was Republican secretaries of state in Washington that have pushed it really hard. It looks like that partisan consensus may be kind of rotting away. And in an unobserved way because these are blue states, right? But that's certainly one dynamic that I can see, kind of a change dynamic.
Okay, that's amazing. All right, we're gonna close with that.